dive right into everyone's favorite topic of financial analysis. And actually, you know, jokes aside, everything that you do as a firm, in many ways, will sooner or later find its way to the P&L. The P&L for me is not just a scorecard. And many business owners treat it that way. It's like a scoreboard that tells them whether they're winning or losing. The look at the P&L is almost like the dashboard on your car. The dashboard on your car will tell you a lot of important things about what's going on. First of all, it will tell you how fast you're going and are you going fast enough. But very importantly, it will also show you if any red lights are blinking, if your tires are soft, if you're running out of gas, if you're overheating, any of those issues with your car will probably show up on the dashboard. And the P&L is a very good place to look at when you're wondering, are we doing well enough as a firm? It's very easy, and business owners do it all the time, I do it all the time, to make sort of leaping statements, big assumptions about the firm and say, well, we're not growing fast enough. We're not profitable enough. We're spending too much money on this. We don't have enough people. We have enough people. All of those kinds of statements can and should be validated on the P&L. And that's what I want to focus on this morning is, let's look at the P&L as a dashboard, and let's try to find out, first of all, can we validate the statements we were making in the strengths and weaknesses section? If we believe something is a weakness, can we find that weakness on the P&L? If something is a strength, can we actually validate that on the income statement? By the way, income statement and P&L are the same thing. And then very importantly, is there something there that we missed? Is there a strength or weakness, a feature of our firm that we should be thinking about? And there's some very sort of specific financial features that would be there and that we should be looking at. Make sense? So let's actually open the P&L and take a look at what it looks like. So the P&L, the income statement, is one of three fundamental accounting statements. The other two being, so it's an income statement, it's a statement of cash flow and a balance sheet. Statement of cash flows are relatively more rare. And not every company produces them, but if you have two balance sheets and an income statement, you can produce it on your own. That's a financial exercise that I leave for the CFAs in the room. But the P&L basically tells you how you're operating as a company. It answers the fundamental question of, are we profitable? If the question is, are we profitable, the answer is on the income statement, on the P&L. This is known as a common size P&L, where everything is expressed as percentage of revenue. Percentage of revenue, typically net revenue. If there's some adjustment to your revenue, that would be made before we actually use that as a denominator. Make sense? So everything expressed as percentage of revenue. The P&L of an advisory firm should consist of these three sections. The first section is what we will call direct expense. If we were a retail firm, that would be our cost of goods sold. If we were a manufacturing firm, that would be the cost of manufacturing. We are a service firm, and our cost of manufacturing, quote unquote, is really the compensation to the professionals in our firm. We provide advice, so for the most part, this is the compensation of the advisors. Make sense? Now, who are the advisors? The advisors, very importantly, are the partners, the owners of the firm that practice as advisors. So if Philip is a CEO, but he also meets with clients most of the time, his compensation is in direct expense. If Janky is a partner, and her primary responsibility is to attract clients to the firm and meet with clients, her compensation is in the direct expense. If Doug is a lead advisor or employee of the firm, his compensation is the direct expense. If I am a service advisor, my compensation is the direct expense. If I'm a paraplanner and financial planner, my compensation is there. So the entire advisory department, for the most part, is in that category. Make sense? Yeah, Fran?
So the paraplanner, if you could just circle back to that, because some firms use a paraplanner, you know, to my view, in more of an admin role, and some in more of a like junior advisor role. And since I'm hiring this person next month, I've had this exact question about how to count this compensation.
Well, if we assume the title is correct, so you can use the paraplanner as a goalkeeper on your soccer team, and that's fine. But assuming the paraplanner acts as a planner, the compensation should be in the direct expense.
So even though they're not meeting with clients typically?
Meetings with clients have nothing to do with it. Really just has to do with, are they part of the advisory services that we provide? And I would probably argue that the financial plan you create is part of the advisory services we provide. So I think almost of a medical practice, sometimes that could be a little more clear. anyone who's involved in providing medical services, that includes the nurses, will be a professional in this context, will be part of the direct expense. But anyone who's doing the paperwork, anyone who's at the front office will be administrative employee. So department by department, generally speaking, your entire advisory department is in the direct expense. Generally speaking, your investment department is in the direct expense. Generally speaking, your operations department is in overhead. Generally speaking, your admin department, actually all of your admin department is in the overhead. So sort of we split the firm in the middle. Advisory and investment is in direct expense. Administrative and operations is in overhead. You should never look at these as somehow carrying any kind of a value judgment to them. It's not like direct expense is better than overhead. Overhead kind of, I don't know, sometimes in colloquial language we speak of overhead as waste. It's like, oh, it's just pure overhead. I would quote my former mentor and the CEO, currently CEO of Persian Advisor Solutions, Mark Version. Mark used to say that my dream is to become overhead. Because the CEO is in the overhead. If you wanted to, any validation in overhead is really where a lot of value lies. Is your chief executive officer should be in the overhead. Your chief operating officer should be in the overhead. People whose primary job is to manage the firm are in overhead. And so overhead has as much value as anything else on the P&L. Make sense?
Do you split off people that wear like split their time between two different departments?
It's possible, and if you wanted to kind of complicate your life, you certainly can. But I am kind of a fan of asking what's your primary position. And your primary position is going to determine what you do. And primary position is defined by what you do most of the time. And if most of the time you're in client meetings, and if most of the time you're developing your business, you're an advisor. It almost doesn't matter what your title is and what your website says. Because I will tell you that advisory firms sometimes are very inaccurate in their job descriptions and titles. Sometimes they get unnecessarily creative. There are a lot of cheap strategists all over the place. And there are a lot of titles like that. So the titles are a little unclear. At the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road is, are they primarily involved in servicing clients and attracting clients to the firm? And the answer is yes, that's an advisor. Tim Koch is a good example of that. Tim will tell you that until his last day as a CEO, he was still in client meetings. But at one point in time, his primary job shifted from being in client meetings to actually managing the firm. And at that point in time, he became a CEO. So if you want to be super accurate, you can carve out, let's say, 25% of his compensation and say, okay, that's for advisory, and the rest is for in the overhead. But I would probably just say, whenever you cross the boundary, you just kind of go to the next one. If that makes sense. So advisory department, investment department, they are part of direct expense. And then the other line in the direct expense that does show up in some firms is also any compensation to solicitors who are involved in business development. In other words, if you have an agreement with a CPA firm, the solicitation fees are there. If you're using the custodial channels for business development, the payment to custodians would be there as well. Does that make sense? That will be part of the direct expense. Yeah.
What about marketing and promotion?
Generally, most of your marketing expenses will be in the overhead. If there's something very specifically related to a very specific business development case and a very specific client, it could probably go in direct expense. But the easy answer is most of your marketing expenses are overhead, but any sort of particularly solicitor fees would be in the direct expense. To a degree, if you're offsetting trading costs or any other manager expenses for a client, that will also be in direct expense, but that's a relatively rare practice, if that makes sense. Now, here's the punchline in that joke. It's not a joke at all, actually, it's very serious. This direct expense should not exceed 40% of the revenue. So the cost of sales and service should not exceed 40% of the revenue. That's a general guideline. Where does that guideline come from? Nothing scientific, actually, but about 20 years worth of benchmarking studies seem to demonstrate that what we see on the screen is kind of the normal P&L of an advisory firm. Well, normal, of course, is a very broad term and potentially sort of iffy, but this is, when we look at the P&L, this is kind of what we're hoping to see. And then below the direct expense, we will have overhead. Overhead will consist of, first of all, compensation to all the administrative and operations employees of the firm. The second largest item will typically be either technology or occupancy, depending on the nature of your firm. Obviously, the third would be, again, technology and occupancy, and it will go down from there. Some firms may be slightly different than that, but generally that's what it will look like. You'll see a copy of the investment news study that we produce on Slack. That will suggest to you more detailed categories under overhead. And it goes all the way down to onesies and twosies and telephone bills and things like that. But overhead in total should not exceed 35% of the revenue. Typically, about 15 of the 35 are related to staff. That's the compensation of the administrative and operations employees. Now, some firms may get a little more complicated. If you have multiple offices, and depending on the way in which you treat multiple offices, you may have every office have its own P&L, so you have what's known as a profit center. Then you may have some sort of a central location or headquarters or home office, some enterprise kind of a place where you have a lot of the employees, and that will be a cost center that typically is allocated to the overhead too. Does that make sense? So it may get more complicated than that, but 95% of the firms in this room have a P&L that looks something like that. So 40% to direct expense, 35% to overhead should produce a profit of about 25% give or take. Make sense? Now, some firms will go to 30, even 35, some firms will go to 40. I have even seen 50 and above. But 25 is a good number to start with. And really, basically, anything above 25 would be considered good profitability. This is normal profitability for an advisory firm. That means that you're doing well in terms of profitability. And anything under 25 will make me scratch my head a little bit. And if it drops under 15, I will be doing a lot more than just scratching my head. I'll be worried about it. And if it drops below 0, then that's really troublesome because in the service industries, in the advisory industry, firms losing money should be very, very, very rare. If that makes sense. We are not manufacturing, we are not retail, so periods of losing money are periods of a lot of trouble. That shouldn't be happening. So anything under 25 is potentially problematic and begs the question, why? Why are we not as profitable as we should be? So here is the simplest exercise of the entire session. Take a quick look at your P&L and tell me if you're profitable enough.
Too profitable.
You are. You absolutely are.
We're understaffed.
Yeah. Let's give everybody a chance to just peek quickly at the P&L. It should be a very quick statement. Are we profitable or not? Are we not? All right. So, are we? Frank, you said we're too profitable. So what is your profit margin? About 45%. About 45%. It happens quite a bit actually. Why are you so profitable? What's different on your P&L? Is it the direct expenses? Is it the overhead?
The other advisors are undercompensated. That would be us. And so direct expense is low and overhead is low. They're both low.
Great. Begin there. Don't jump to conclusions too quickly. Begin with the statement very simply. This is low and this is low. And stop there for a moment. Pause there for a moment. People usually rush down the street full steam going like, oh, somebody's undercompensated, somebody's overcompensated. Those are very, very, very big statements. Generally, the statement someone is overcompensated or undercompensated is a big and dangerous statement. Because that implies that someone is not doing enough or someone's compensation should be changing. We really, at that point in time, we're messing with people's lives. And we probably want to do that very, very carefully and thoughtfully. Before we determine how someone is paid, we probably need to look at compensation studies too. We can't just look at a P&L and say, oh, this is what's happening. We need to examine compensation statements. We need to be thoughtful about what's our compensation philosophy and so on. And we will do that in our second session. The P&L, simply we need to kind of determine, is overhead high? Is direct expense high? If we're not profitable enough, which category of expenses is more than it should be? And then we can dig deeper why. But at least at the moment, let's pause there. So one other team, are we profitable enough or not? Yeah, guys.
We've got
JBG, you have kind of a very interesting situation.
We have 0 technical operating profit because we have 4 silos. And
Yeah.
I look at the partner draw is around 63% on average.
Yeah, so let's make the simplistic statement. Our profit margin is 0 because our which expense is high?
Direct.
The direct expense is currently what percent of revenue?
About 63.
63%. So very simple. So if your direct expense is so high, obviously your profit is 0. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the expenses. First of all, 75%, 80% of the expenses of an advisory firm are people related. So whenever we're not profitable enough, it has something to do with people. Most likely has something to do with compensation. And then behind that, we also have benefits, payroll taxes, we have training, education, and other expenses. But generally speaking, whatever's going on in the P&L probably has to do with people. So if we have direct expense that's very high, then if we want to dig a little deeper into that, we need to have a clicker. Oh, there it is. And let's actually dive a little bit deeper into direct expense, particularly the topic of owner compensation. Owners, depending on the size of the firm, will account anywhere from half of the direct expense to all the way to 100% of the direct expense in a smaller firm. And owner income needs to be broken down into some categories that are very, very important, because without that breakdown, we're going to struggle analyzing the P&L, and we may struggle running the firm as well. Imagine for a moment, I have $1 million practice. And imagine for a moment I'm the only advisor, there's no other advisor. And I'm the only professional. Somehow we have, let's say, let's make it 350,000 in expenses, whatever I'm spending that money on, let's not worry about it. And the remaining 650,000 are my personal income as an owner. Make sense? That's income. I want to underline that word. That's my income. My income probably needs to be broken down into two categories. Part of that income I earn because I work there. I'm an employee, a quasi-employee of the practice. I'm an advisor, I service clients, I attract clients to the firm, I do a job. And my job is to be an advisor, and that job deserves compensation. My labor is not for free because I'm an owner. I actually need to be paid for what I do. That job, being an advisor, is probably worth something like around, let's say for simplicity terms, let's say it's worth something along the lines of $250,000 a year. Because I'm really good at it, because I'm highly qualified, and so on and so forth. Let's, for the sake of argument, say that I'm making $650,000 in income a year, but $250,000 of that is my compensation. The remaining $400,000 are my profits. Exactly. This is why it's very important to determine the compensation to the owners properly so that we can calculate profits. Notice that I can manipulate profit very easily by simply increasing my salary. If I say, all right, my salary is going to double from $250 to $500, my profit goes from $400 to $100. All of a sudden, it dropped by 75%. In other words, in an advisory firm, if you look into the profit margins and they don't seem right, the first place I would go is to ask the question, are owners compensated properly? Generally speaking, practicing partners, owners who are advisors, are paid somewhere between $200,000 to as much as $350,000, $400,000 to be advisors. CEOs can be paid a little more than that. So in a situation like their firm, just for a moment, when the owners are paying themselves an enormous amount of compensation, you're going to see the profit go down to zero. If I'm the only owner, that probably is not a problem at all. I mean, it's like shifting money from left pocket to right pocket. It doesn't matter. It's still my money. But when there are a lot of pockets involved, this becomes a big issue. Imagine for a moment I have this fancy practice, and I voted myself a $600,000 salary, so our income is down to $50,000 or so, just 5% of the firm. Can happen very easily in a solo firm. And you have a solo firm, and some of you in the room actually operate in solo firms as well, so that's kind of an important feature. Imagine for a moment that Jackie becomes my partner, and she's going to buy into my practice. Now, what is Jackie buying? If she's buying, let's say, 10% of the practice, she's buying most likely 10% of the profits, right? If the profit is $650,000, then she's buying $65,000 worth of cash flow distributions. If the profit is $50,000, she's buying only $5,000 of cash flow distributions. A very dramatic shift, and that entire number is easily manipulated by my salary. So before Jackie buys into the firm, I got to make a fair determination of what my salary should be. Otherwise, what in the world is she buying? I think she would rather buy 650,000 worth of profit rather than 5,000. Make sense? It may get particularly dangerous if our valuation is based on revenue. Let's say somebody came up with 2.5 times revenue, so we're worth 2.5 million. So the valuation is based on revenue, but her distributions are based on profits. And if the profits are low because my salary is inflated, she's going to have a very hard time buying that. If the valuation is based on a multiple of EBITDA or a multiple of profit, EBITDA and profit usually are very interchangeable, some adjustments necessary, then we may have less of a problem with it. Still, in order to have a good partnership, I need to carefully define what portion of my income is compensation. Make sense? In a larger firm, not just with one partner, but with multiple partners, it's still an issue. Because sometimes you see the founders, 2, 3, 4 people, determine compensation that's just not right. And so they collectively have compensation that's not right, so G2 may struggle buying into that firm. Make sense? So step number 1 in analyzing P&L is, are we profitable? If we're not, the first place I would go is owner compensation. At this point in time, we're not well equipped to judge owner compensation. We haven't done all the work on benchmarking studies and talking about how to set salaries and so on. So at this point in time, just stop at the statement, are direct expenses too high? Why it's too high? We suspect it has something to do with owner compensation. In your case, definitely yes. But pause there, because next session we'll dive into it a little more. Yeah?
Sorry, quick question about owner's compensation. If the owner is not providing advisory services, let's say they're a CEO or COO that is not an advisor, should they still be in direct expense?
No, they should be overhead. Like, I can, for example, a CEO that's primarily a CEO. So Patricia is most likely in direct expense, because she's CEO, but she primarily works with clients. Anders, on the other hand, is definitely overhead. And for example, a COO, definitely overhead. Chief Marketing Officer, definitely overhead.
I thought you just said COO a short minute ago was a direct expense.
No, never.
If he had advisory role.
If I said that, it has to do with the margaritas last night.
Okay.
Never. The Chief Operating Officer, the COO, my accent can play sometimes games as well, but the Chief Operating Officer is essentially never in direct expense, always in overhead.
Okay.
A CEO may be in either, because a lot of CEOs are not full-time CEOs. Most of their job, in a lot of firms, the primary job is being an advisor. But a real CEO, someone like George Stapleton, for example, definitely overhead.
Got it, thank you.
The Chief Investment Officer, almost always direct expense. I can't think of a reason why not. Generally speaking, your Chief Administrative Officers, your entire leadership on the administrative side, definitely overhead.
Wait a minute, did you just say Chief Investment Officer though? That's indirect, right?
Definitely direct expense.
Direct.
Yeah, I would, to avoid confusion, I'm never going to use the term indirect expense. It's always going to be either direct expense or overhead.
And that's not a...
And your Chief Investment Officer, in my mind, is definitely always direct expense.
Okay.
Your entire investment department, outside of, sometimes some firms put investment operations inside the investment department.
That's, yeah.
And if that's the case, those operations-oriented employees that are part of the investment department, they will probably be overhead.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Now, you gotta remember, you can run your P&L however you want to run your P&L. Whatever makes sense to you is how you want to run it. As long as that P&L gives you insight into what's happening and how we're doing. But when you start benchmarking, you want your P&L to be structured the same way the benchmarks are structured. And generally speaking, when I make these recommendations where people should be, that's how the benchmarks are typically structured, so you can compare apples to apples. But if you decide that it makes a lot of sense for us to put the Chief Investment Officer in overhead, that's good with me. As long as you realize that when we benchmark, we've got to sort of flip it around. Sorry, Dan.
No, it's fine. Partners comp, I would assume, too, includes any perks or benefits that the owner would receive. So like one unique thing in our firm that I always look at in trying to figure all this out is qualified plan contributions. So if you're a sole owner of a firm, you can shelter a lot of taxes by funneling a lot of your profits into a qualified plan. In terms of looking at this and defining what an owner's comp is, should that be included in their comp calc?
Generally, when we say comp, we mean total comp, so that we include all the benefits that they receive. when it comes down to owner's comp, we just got to be careful that the benefits they receive are the normal level of benefits that an employee would receive, that they're not going somewhere in exotic overboard territory by being an owner. If they're using a defined contribution plan, a 401k plan with a profit sharing feature and a safe harbor feature, which will allow them to max out the contributions, that's definitely direct expense and that's normal compensation. If they've been going crazy and wild and designing their own private pension and they have some kind of a defined benefit plan, very, very rarely people do, but sometimes they might, I would probably then say, there you're going overboard big time. Now, notice something very important. Your tax return will not look like this. The IRS does not look at your firm in anything like this. So your classifications for the tax return are going to be very different than these classifications. What we're trying to do here is not file our taxes, we're trying to manage the firm. So under your tax return, if you're an LLC filing like a partnership, your owners will actually have no compensation whatsoever. Everything is going to be K1 income. That's your tax return, that's not what we're talking about. But in your management P&L, when we look at are we managing the firm well, are we profitable, that is my recommendation, is that you've got to carve out fair compensation for the labor that the partners put into the business, and that will allow you to calculate good profitability. It will also allow you to have a partnership. Without good compensation practices in the firm, you will not be able to structure your partnership because it's not clear what you're buying. Where's the profit? What is the profit? Yeah, Susan?
Yeah. So something that has been confusing me about the comp studies that I've been looking at for years is this seems to be laid out like those compensation studies. So you're saying that when I look at partner compensation or owner compensation or anything really as compensation up under direct expense, that includes those individuals' benefits, but they are separated when I look under operating expense. So that comp number for administrative staff is salary bonus only. All their other benefits are separated?
For practical purposes. So, in theory and practice are the same thing. In practice, they never are. That's an Einstein quote. For practical purposes, most firms filling out compensation surveys find it very, very difficult to allocate benefits person by person, position by position. As a result of that, frequently compensation firm studies simply say, give us the cost of all benefits combined just in one place. We don't want to separate it. Generally, I would prefer to see it separated because it's compensation, whether it's benefits, whether it's bonuses, it's still compensation. By the way, all the bonuses are allocated the same way as the salaries are. But for practical purposes, most firms are saying, you know what, it takes us 10 hours to fill out your darn survey, and the last thing we want to do is allocate, 401k contributions person by person, department by department, just too much work. So usually compensation surveys just put benefits as one line for the entire firm.
Okay, perfect.
And I know that's somewhat inconsistent with what I said, but just unfortunately people would prefer to not do that. Someday when we can somehow insist on every firm taking a day out of their life to fill out our survey, we would be able to separate them, but unfortunately at the moment that doesn't work.
Okay, thank you.
And some of the smaller firms go overboard with benefits, particularly owner benefits, because there's some tax advantages to that. But in larger firms, that becomes less of an issue. Same for payroll taxes, by the way. It's one line. It should be multiple lines, but it's one line because we just don't want to separate it out. ADP doesn't, so we don't do that. Make sense? So here's kind of an interesting twist on this. Imagine we have an advisor. His name is Doug Johnson. And we pay him 30% of the revenue he's responsible for. Where does that go? It's not a salary. We pay him 30% of the revenue he generates. Where does that go? Direct expense, yeah. He's an advisor, so it doesn't matter how we pay him. Whether we pay him by the hour, if we pay him a percent of the revenue, if we pay him a salary, regardless of the compensation method, that's where it goes. Make sense? So owner compensation needs to be separated, and when it's separated, we also open the door to kind of an interesting phenomenon. Imagine for a moment Doug and I were partners, and I kind of don't feel like working anymore, to be honest. But I want to keep my ownership in the business. I own 20% of the business, but I just don't want to be a consultant anymore. I'm just tired of traveling. So I kind of stopped working. What happens to my income? Definitely goes down. What portion of my income will go down? Salary, exactly. So if we've broken down my income into compensation and profit, theoretically I can stop working, which means I stop receiving salary, but I am still an owner, so I can continue receiving distributions from the farm. So when we do that separation of income between compensation for labor and return on investment, profit distributions, we open the door to passive ownership, which is very important. Tim is still a shareholder in Aspirion. When they have profits, they send out checks, they send him a check. He no longer works there. He hasn't worked there in 10 years, so he does not receive W-2s and 1099s, but he continues to receive a K-1 from the profit distributions. Make sense? So if we want to have passive owners, if we want to have owners that are either retired or institutional owners or so on, we need to make that separation between what I'm paid for working there and what I actually earn for being an owner there. That will also create the foundation for anyone buying into the firm, because otherwise if the profit is not clean and clear, it will be very difficult to buy it. Make sense? Cool. I skipped through a few things that are actually important, and I keep playing with the on and off button of my clicker, so it's kind of a problem. We had an interesting discussion yesterday of how does profitability change as firms are growing. And so these are firms of various sizes, from 1 million and below, all the way to 15 million and above, which is kind of at the moment at least the largest category we're tracking. What's going on with their profits? Kind of what's the pattern, what's the trend there? I would probably say very stable. What do you think about that? You've grown from $1 million firm to a $20 million firm, and your profit has dramatically changed from 24.5 to 23.6. Statistically, insignificant change. What do you think of that? Why grow if your profit margin is growing the same? Yeah, it's the dollar numbers. People fall in this trap a lot. Actually, I really have seen articles written about how you shouldn't grow because you really can't improve your profit margin. Well, the margin, the percentages don't improve, but the numbers behind the bank account, they actually improve pretty steadily and significantly. So this is the personal pre-tax income. Remember, income rather than compensation. So this is lumping together everything per owner. Of firms of various sizes, and here you can clearly see why it's actually pretty good picture to go. And here the trend is very clear. Growth rewards the largest firms. Obviously, owners in largest firms achieve very high levels of income. Now, this is average income. So if a firm has 10 million in EBITDA and it has, let's say, 5 owners, we basically saying 10 divided by 5 equals 2 million per owner. In reality, those 5 owners are probably not equal owners. One of them may be an 80% owner. The others could be, 4 people dividing 5%. But we treat them as if they're equal, just so we can calculate the number. But it does give you kind of a sense. If you ever hear owners talking about, well, we're not making enough income, that's probably the benchmark. Like at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, what do you take to the bank? But I noticed at the very end that kind of income drops down quite a bit. Why is that? Be careful with the judgmental statements. Many partners is the correct statement. Too many implies judgment, that we should have had 20, but we have 30. And again, be careful with this. It's like imagine you're holding a scalpel and there's a human cadaver in front of you, an alive one actually, a live body. Be careful with these statements because once you make them, they kind of tend to stick. You say in a management meeting that we have too many partners. Next thing you know, everybody's saying, oh, we have too many partners. That's very clear. I mean, we've known this for a long time. No, that's not clear at all. We know we have many. What's too many is a very judgment call. It assumes we know how many we should have. And I actually can't tell you how to calculate that. That's not a mechanical measure. What is happening, though, is in the largest firms, there's a concentrated effort, and you heard that yesterday, to have more partners, because we need more partners in order to be permanent. If we're going to have a good chance at this size to remain a permanent firm and not go through some kind of an external transaction, we're going to need a lot of people. So notice Aspirion has about 65 owners for about 240 employees, give or take. About 1 out of every 4 every team members is a partner. Private Ocean sounded like, Susan, it sounded like you have 25 partners on about 60 employees, give or take.
21 partners, 51 employees.
Yeah, so it's about 1 to 3, even almost 1 to 2 ratio. Very high ratio of partners to team members. That's really what's happening in largest firms. They're trying to involve a lot of people in the ownership of the firm because that allows them to achieve better succession outcomes. It also allows them to draw their best people into the ownership of the firm and retain them better that way. Make sense? Smallest firms actually don't do that much. And somewhere around 7 to 10 million is kind of the peak of owner income because at that size, it may still be me and Doug, just a small number of owners, now enjoying tremendous profitability of a firm they've created. But whenever you see these high numbers, you also have to kind of wonder, well, are we going past the point of no return when it comes to succession? Like if we really harvest that income too long, we are in danger of creating a firm that just can't transition internally because the valuation has just flown off the handle and we don't have enough people involved. Tim said something yesterday that's very important to understand is that when it comes to succession, early and often helps a lot. If we involve more people, if we involve them early, if we go through equity transactions, often it helps. The more we wait, the more the profits are growing because we are in a growing industry, and the higher these numbers get, the more difficult succession becomes. This is not to force the owners to sell. You really can't. But mathematically speaking, when you see numbers like this, you just kind of have to wonder, how is this going to work out? All right, so first question is, why are we profitable? Second question is, are we growing? It's a very, very important question. Why do we need to grow? It's kind of a philosophical question, but why do we need to grow? Yeah,
people save money so they can eventually spend it.
Yeah, I mean, but why do we need more money? I mean, look, we're making a ton of money here. Why do we need to make even more money?
Growth provides opportunity for other people in the organization.
Yes, exactly. Please remember that because you are the other people in the organization. For the most part, growth is necessary so that we can grow careers, so that we can grow responsibilities of G2, so we can grow the income of G2, so we can involve G2 in ownership. If we are not growing and we're involving more and more people in the ownership of the firm, what happens? We just get losing existing owners. But if we're growing faster, then we can actually add more and more people to the ownership of the firm without experiencing dilution. Now, growth is a difficult subject because in profit terms, it's relatively simple. It's either 25% or higher or 25% or lower. It's a pretty quick determination of how we're profitable or not. Unfortunately, with growth, the industry changes its growth rates very dynamically. So in any given year, what may have been a fast growth in another year may be slow growth in that year. So we're very vulnerable to the markets in some very obvious ways. We're vulnerable to investment sentiment in some obvious ways. We're vulnerable to things that I don't even understand sometimes. But some years are slow and some years are fast, and the last few years have been slow. And it used to be advisory firms between 2003, which was kind of a small recession, and 2007, on the eve of the big recession, advisory firms were growing 25% plus per year. They were doubling in size every 3 years. It was just amazing growth. And even on the recovery of the recession, 2009 to about 2012, 13, were years of relatively fast growth. And then the last 5 years have been in the single digits. And what you see here is the growth rate of firms of various sizes in 2018, which is the last full fiscal year we had at the time we were compiling these slides. 2019 numbers are starting to emerge, and they're kind of starting to look a little bit like that. What do you think of this? Well, take a quick. This is, okay, very good question. Is this revenue growth? Is this asset growth? We, generally speaking, when we talk about growth, we will talk about revenue growth most of the time. Now, asset growth is very important, and asset growth, generally speaking, is a leading indicator. If our assets are growing, our revenue is usually not growing as fast, but we will see that growth next year. Because let's say we landed a $100 million account and we landed it in December. It hasn't really built, so we can't really see the revenue on the P&L, but it's going to build next year, so it's going to be there. So usually if you see asset growth go high, that means next year is going to be a good year. Unless something unpredictable happens and assets drop down below. Vice versa, if for some reason we see assets flat this year, even if we're growing revenue this year well, next year is going to be uphill battle. Make sense? Typically, when we measure growth, we want to measure revenue growth because assets translate into revenue. That's the whole idea. But they don't always translate in revenue at the same rate as previous clients. Sometimes we have institutional clients, they have a lot to assets, but not so much to revenue and things like that. So to remove these nuances, when we measure growth, generally we are measuring revenue growth. So take a quick look at your case study firm, compare to these numbers based on size, and let's talk about, are you growing fast enough or not? How are we doing around? Are we growing, not growing?
We're growing.
Yeah.
The rate is slowing.
Slowing. How are we doing relative to the industry?
We're still above the industry average.
Good. It gets interesting. When we wrote the Nirvana case, we wrote it to be a slow growth, stagnant firm. And then the industry started slowing down so much that we don't know what to do with the case. Like, how slow could this be without actually shrinking?
Right.
So when your benchmark is 4.9%, it's, you can outperform that. I guess as they say in Bulgaria, the key to happiness is having low expectations. So
yes.
you're outperforming the benchmark, but you're nowhere near your expectations. Guess what is the expectation of the industry? When the industry says we plan for growth, what's the number they have in mind? Most firms are budgeting 10%. Most firms, when they are budgeting growth, are budgeting 10% net of markets. Net of markets. Obviously, the markets, if we could predict the markets, we're probably wasting our time here. But net of markets, most firms are shooting for 10%. Does that strike you as high or low or something like that?
In the last few years, it's like, a little bit high.
In the last few years, we've kind of lost that. That said, you gotta remember, so most firms are making distributions to clients. Industry-wide distributions are averaging around 2 to 2.5% of the assets. So it's kind of, you can call it the tailwind, the headwind, sorry. The headwind is about 2.5 distributions, and then you're gonna lose some clients. You're always gonna lose some clients. No matter how amazing you are, nature's gonna take away some clients from you, and people are gonna move, and a variety of circumstances will happen. And that portion of the headwind is about 1.5% or so. So about 4% of the assets are just eroding out of your balance sheet all the time. So you got to replace that. So if you're growing at 5%, you're barely replacing erosion. So 10% really is, in some ways, a net growth of 10% is necessary in order to maintain pace, in order to maintain speed. And also to maintain the rate of growth of compensation increases. Obviously, if your compensation is growing faster than your revenue, eventually it's going to show up on the P&L as declining profits. So to continue growing the compensation of people you have, continue creating careers, you want to kind of start giving 10%. And that's where the rubber meets the road is, unfortunately, a lot of firms look at that and say, well, 10% is really fast, why don't we go for 5? But then when you have conversations about partnership, when am I going to be a partner? When you have conversations about when am I going to get a pay increase? When you have conversations about when do I get promoted? Those conversations have to change if we're changing our growth rate to 5%. So forgive me for a moment, Dave. When I was a partner in Moss Adams, kind of generally speaking, the firm will coach you that you should expect to be a partner about 10 years into your career as a practicing consultant or a CPA. About 10 years is what it takes to make partner. Advisory firms, when we measure the same number, kind of had expectations sometimes of 6 to 7 years. 6 to 7 years was a number we used to see in the study. If we're growing at 5%, we can't make partners 6 to 7 years. We gotta go to 10%, 10 years, 12 years like the CPA industry does, because at the rate of 6, 7 years to become a partner, we just can't grow fast enough to avoid dilution. Does that make sense? So, because you participate in some of these conversations, you kind of have to understand that if I want to be a partner faster, if I want to achieve high income faster, I need to help my firm to grow. Because if I'm not helping the growth, the money is going to come out of the existing owners' pockets and they're not going to be happy about it. You will not create a healthy partnership. So if you want to participate in the conversation about the pace and speed of your career, you got to participate in the growth conversation somehow too. Make sense? We got to grow the firm, because if we don't, our careers can't grow as fast.
When you guys wrote these case studies, should we assume that the markets did what they did in these years? So like in our case study, we grew 6% in 19.
Yeah.
Which, given the year we just had the markets, I would look at to say our firm had negative organic growth. Because if they were only up 6 and the average client portfolio was up 12, I'd look at that to go, our firm had outflows, but should we be making those kind of assumptions when we look at the data?
Yeah, the data is fully transparent, so the data will tell you what the market was growing at, in the case.
Where?
You have the spreadsheet, right?
We don't see that. I don't see net new assets versus, growth of assets.
Yeah, talk to Doug.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about fully disclosing all the numbers, so that should be there.
I think we said that market appreciation for 2019 was either 5 or 6%, so it wasn't accurate of what it was, what it actually was. But I'll
Yeah, yes, for some reason. But if you need more, these numbers should be fully transparent. If they're not for some reason, please talk to my colleagues and we can fix that. Generally, we ignore the markets in all of these cases. I don't know what to do with the markets. They certainly have an influence, but it's not like you can predict them. And we also don't want to dwell on their effect too much because this is not the CFA Institute. So we want to focus on what happens to the revenue for the most part. But that's kind of the growth story. Yeah, Frank?
So one performance indicator I've been looking at is this net new assets, which was a term I got from Ron Carson. So we try to separate that out every year or every quarter, really, like what were net new assets, what we're rolling, that's what we hope to control. Is that something that you guys use that expression, or not so much, or?
Very much. No, I mean, net new assets is a great performance indicator. And generally speaking, if you look at a full dashboard, the performance indicators you can see on a full dashboard can be as many as 20, 30, 40, or so on. At the moment, we're going to focus on 5 of them and understanding 5 of them, but net new assets will be that leading indicator and eventually it's going to turn into revenue. And you can always break down the asset flows into business development versus contributions versus acquired assets, which for some firms is also a measure that's important. Generally speaking, when you manage the firm in terms of growth, you're focusing on new client assets from new clients. Sometimes you can see a firm that has excellent contributions and is growing that way. That's a very good source of growth. That's a very valid source of growth. But potentially that's a source of growth that means that we're not replenishing the clients that we have. So we're kind of in danger over time that if we're not adding new clients, if those contributions versus distributions change, that we will be in trouble. Make sense? So profitability is one measure, growth is one measure, and then let's dive into productivity. Before we dive into productivity, actually, overhead is kind of a good number to take a look at. Overhead tells us, are we efficient? Are we using our back office well? Are we using the platforms and services that we've created well? That's basically your overhead number. Your overhead percentage should cover around 35%. As you can see, firms of various sizes may, exceed that number by a little bit here and there. Yeah?
Did you say, Paul, that you include broker-dealer or custodial fees within direct expenses while later you said that?
No, I never said the word broker-dealer. I'm pretty sure of that.
For custodial fees, whatever.
So custodial referral fees are part of direct expense.
Okay.
If you have a broker-dealer or if you have some sort of complicated arrangement that I can't even think of, you may need to start with gross revenue less adjustments equals net revenue. But very accurately, if you have a broker-dealer, your revenue is the amount you get paid by the broker-dealer, not the amount that the client pays. That's the broker-dealer's revenue. Your revenue is the amount you get paid. Some of you have that, so to clarify that. Imagine I have $1 million in revenue, gross revenue, but I work through a broker-dealer and I have a 90% payout. So my revenue on the P&L is going to be $900,000, not $1 million. My broker-dealer is going to record revenue of $1 million, and then it's going to record their direct expense of $900,000, which is my compensation. You don't have to worry about their P&L. We don't have to worry about broker-dealers for the most part. But your revenue is the amount you receive from the broker-dealer, not the amount that the client pays. Does it make sense? Because technically speaking, if you have a broker-dealer, the client has a contract with the broker-dealer, and you represent the broker-dealer in that contract. The contract is not between you and the client. The contract is between you and the broker-dealer, and then you represent the broker-dealer so they pay you. Much like if you're an RIA, the contract is between the client and the RIA, and then you as a professional represent that RIA. Make sense? So broker-dealer firms, several in the room, you start with the net revenue you get paid. Good. Overhead. If your overhead is higher than the benchmark, what does that mean?
Potentially overstaffed.
Yeah, that was the trap. Yes, I got.
I said potentially.
Potentially is a good qualifier. Generally, that means we're spending more money than a firm of the same size. Why are we spending more money? We got to dig a little bit deeper. Maybe we have more people. Maybe we have more technology. Maybe we wanted to have more people in technology. We got to kind of go line by line and examine that. But generally, it means we're spending more money than a firm of the same size, and that probably affects our profitability. So we kind of have to be wondering, why is this happening? Is this something we want to continue doing? Yeah, hello.
I see this, maybe you're investing for growth. So you're positioning yourself so that
Yeah, probably. I mean, very often that's a term that's get used to sort of dress up the fact that we're not doing what we perhaps should be doing. But it could be, it could be. I mean, imagine, for example, especially in a small firm, we have a team of 4. And then we hire, let's say, a project manager. And we go from a team of 4 to a team of 5. So immediately at that size, you're going to see a huge impact on the P&L. And in that year, we may see overhead be higher than the benchmark. And should that alarm us? No, not at all. Like you said, we know we're investing in growth. We know we want to have that position. This is pretty normal. We expected this to happen. We're good.
Is that essentially what's happening in this 5 to 7 million range? When we see the relative performance across all these charts is pretty poor because you're investing, you kind of hit a spot where you need to reinvest in the business to institutionalize?
It's a very good observation. Generally, firms create their infrastructure and invest in platforms and resources right around here. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 million is where you start hiring the COOs of the world, when you start having more administration, you start having a larger platform, you start buying more technology and deploying more technology. So that's the time where you really invest in the business of the future. When you're 7 million, you invest in the firm that you're going to have when you're 15. So that probably is the reason why those firms are, generally speaking, high overhead firms compared to others. That probably is very good. And most of that is really investment in people. I mean, right around 7, 8, 9, 10 million, you start looking at, should we hire a COO? Do we need more people that help us with human resources and technology? Now we need to create a firm that also can manage itself because it's larger and it's more complicated. Notice something on this graph, by the way. We talk very often about larger firms have economies of scale. Do you see economies of scale here?
A little bit. I mean, 10 to 15 is a lot more efficient than 5 to 7.
Yeah, although notice we were saying that the norm should be 35, so even the most efficient and inefficient are still probably exceeding what we would like to see. There's a little bit of efficiency, but not a ton. Generally, not a lot of economies of scale in our industry. Most of all, because our largest expense is people, and people are not very scalable. We still need, for every 80 clients we have, we still need a lead advisor and a service advisor. Your ratio may be 60, maybe 40, depending on the size of the client. So tough to scale that. We can scale our chief operating officer, for example, but as we create economies of scale in some of those resources, we're also going to create diseconomies of scale. Diseconomies of scale come from size. Generally speaking, the larger you are, the more bureaucracy you're going to have. Bureaucracy in the positive sense of the word. In the sense that we just need to spend more time managing ourselves and coordinating. The moment you have multiple offices, you're going to see your overhead shoot through the roof. You're going to invest a lot of resources in communicating across different offices and people who need to do that. So generally speaking, economies of scale are tough to find.
I think you determine 35% of target if no one does it.
I mean, years of experience and a lot of talent. No, I think if you track the surveys historically, you will see that to be sort of the stable historical measure. Now, nobody does that. There's a tendency in good times for all of us to spend more money and to be more likely to invest. And these are good times in the industry. It's been many, many years, knock on wood, since the last recession. As you saw, owner incomes are high. We have the budget, so a lot of firms are basically staffing themselves for the future, preparing for growth, investing in resources, and that's why the overhead tends to be a little higher, because these are good times. We're spending quite a bit. Should we be spending less? Maybe, but nothing wrong with, padding the budgets a little bit in order to create that future growth potential.
You're saying in 09 and 10, you would see a lot more of these numbers were at 34.
Oh yeah, they will drop. Yeah, in a recession, these numbers will drop, because this is where we're also going to go cutting very often too. Unfortunately, when we go cutting, we usually start with who's not in front of a client. what can we cut that clients are not going to notice? There's really nothing we can cut without clients eventually noticing, but the most noticeable things are the people who are going to plan. So this is overhead, and then let's kind of take a look at actually the measures of client quality, for the lack of a better term. So one of the better numbers to look for in a firm is the revenue per client, simply defined as total revenue of the firm divided by the number of client relationships we have. Relationships, in other words, households. So husband and wife, one client. Husband and wife and kid, one client. Kid grows up, starts its own family, and goes on their own. That's two relationships, two families. That splits into two clients. Make sense? Simple total revenue divided by the number of clients. And this is a very important and interesting graph. What do you notice on this graph? What happens with larger firms? Yeah. And the relationship is very, very, very strong, and I want you to remember that. The largest firms have the largest clients. Why is that? Yeah. More people, more expertise, more reputation, more marketing budgets, more salespeople, longevity. Sort of the appearance of a firm that's going to be there for many, many years, as opposed to the. There's a guy on my street. I live in the middle of Seattle. It's a residential neighborhood. We kind of have our own main street in the neighborhood, 45th Avenue, and on 45th there's an office there, and it's an advisor I've never met. But his name is on the door, and his office is kind of one of those kind of storefront offices where you can actually see into the office. And his name is Michael Lawless. Lawless, like literally Lowless. So the name of the firm very creatively is Lawless Financial, which always makes me say, okay, I mean, I like my name too, but you gotta be realistic here. This is not something. And that's why we're not called the Palaveev group, because nobody wants to spell that. So Michael frequently is in the office, and you can literally see him sitting there on his own at his desk. There's nobody else there. I mean, you can see that this practice is basically Michael. And kind of sometimes with small practices, the unfortunate thing, whether we admit it or not, clients sometimes that's what they see. They just kind of see one person and they wonder, is this big enough? Is this stable enough? Can I rely on this? Is this going to be around long enough? So generally speaking, clients that have a lot of choice tend to gravitate towards bigger. Not necessarily the bigger is better, but they kind of have the sense that bigger is more stable, perhaps more reliable. Also, something that's very powerful is that every 100 clients are going to generate something along the lines of 7 to 10 referrals. So when you have 10 clients, you're going to get maybe 1 referral a year. When you have 5,000 clients, you're going to generate a ton of referrals, 350, 500, 700 referrals. In other words, the more clients you have, the more you're going to grow simply by the power of those referrals. So it's an exponential function. The larger you are, the more likely you are to grow at a faster rate. To grow at 10% when you're a $1 billion firm, you need 100,000. When you're a $100,000 firm, all you need is 1 client, $10 million. So larger firms shouldn't be growing as fast, but they are because they have that exponential effect, the benefit of referrals. Larger firms are much more likely to get access to custodial referral channels. They're more likely to strike deals and partnerships with CPA firms, banks, and other centers of influence. Generally speaking, the largest law firms will refer their clients to the largest advisory firms. So a lot of advantages of size. When it comes to growing and attracting clients, a lot of advantages of size.
But recently, hasn't their growth really been through M&A and not organic growth?
Where does that statement come from? Just general perception?
Yes.
Largest firms are growing by M&A, no doubt about it. Part of this is because largest firms actually have the opportunity to engage in M&A much more so than smaller firms. They have the balance sheets, they have the budgets, they have the appetite, they have the people. Small firms just don't really have the opportunity to do as much M&A because when you're $5 million P&L, you're going to have a hard time buying a $10 million P&L. When you're a $100 million P&L, that's a really reasonable acquisition. So generally speaking, when you look at growth from M&A, it's a feature more of large firms than small ones. Although small firms sometimes buy practices, tuck-in practices, and things like that. So there's more growth from M&A in the large firms than there is in the small firm, but that doesn't mean that the large firms are not growing organically. They're growing organically at about the same pace. Does it make sense? Cool. So this will probably tell us if we're working with the right clients. If we say that we target clients that are 2-3 million in assets under management, and our pricing schedule says that we charge about 80 basis points, then we should expect here numbers that are 20,000 or above. Make sense? So when you look at your P&L, there's a number below that calculates the revenue per client. If your revenue per client is not as high as you thought it was going to be, that probably means that two things are possible. Either not working with the right clients or not charging enough, underbilling. And how can we tell which one is it?
Benchmarking.
Benchmarking for sure, but what are we going to benchmark? If our revenue per client is lower, we can take a look at our assets per client, and our assets per client, if we're not charging enough, should be in line with the benchmark. If we're charging enough, that just simply we're going to see that the assets per client and the revenue per client is lower than the benchmark. Is that clear? Because that's kind of important. If our revenue per client is lower than we thought it should be, look at assets per client. If assets per client are also lower, that just means we're working with the wrong clients. We're just making too many exceptions. If our assets per client are right, but revenue per client is not, that means our pricing is off.
Should we be looking at average yield on assets also?
It's an interesting number. So total revenue divided by total assets. It's an interesting number, but it's a dangerous number. Some danger there. Some firms, for example, just have some what I'll call institutional assets. Every firm has this one very large client that's billing at 50, 40, 20 basis points because they're very large. That will skew your number. Your retirement plan assets, if you have any, that will skew your number. When you compare yourself to the benchmark, you also don't know how much institutional business the benchmark has because it's a composite of so many firms. So that will skew your number. In a year when your assets are growing really fast, that number will go down. Simply because you're adding assets, you're not adding revenue, so that relationship will be distorted. The right way to calculate that number is to calculate revenue relative to average assets rather than end-of-year assets. That's a more accurate picture, but it's still a simplistic picture. So it's a number I'll take a look at, but just as a supplementary number. Be careful because that number can be dangerous. Frequently, firms take a look at that and say, oh my God, other firms are billing at 72 basis points on the revenues, and we seem to be at 69, so we're 3 basis points off, we need to increase our fees. Like, look at a lot more numbers before you jump there.
As firms grow, how do you guys feel about minimum fees and minimum account balances? That's something our firm, like our personal firm, is going to struggle with implementing or not implementing. Do you endorse the concept of a hard minimum for account size or at least fee minimums?
To the degree that anybody cares what we think, we probably highly recommend it. Endorse is a big word, but it's like I have a Nike shoe or something. But that would be cool, actually. Why do consultants not have Nike shoes? I would probably say it's a very good idea. We talked about the sort of criteria for client acceptance yesterday. Most firms do have a minimum, and if you have a minimum, you should stick to it, and it kind of is a good protection for a number of things. Making sure you have the right clients, that you're not wasting resources, that you're also designing resources for the right clients. So generally, minimum revenue levels should be part of your client acceptance process. Some firms struggle with that because of the Henrys, young clients that can bring the assets when they have the income. That's why revenue may be a better minimum than assets. Make sense? Cool. So the revenue per client, assets per client will tell us if we're working with the right clients. And then revenue per staff will tell us if we're productive enough. Total revenue of the firm divided by all the people in the firm. All the people, everyone included. Owners, non-owners, administrative, advisory, investment, operations departments. By the way, in my mind, those are the 4 major departments in the firm. Advisory, investment, operations, admin. That will tell us if we're productive or not. That's a general statement across the entire firm. It will not tell us productivity by department, but it will tell us across the entire firm are we productive enough. So imagine my benchmark is about 350 because I'm a large firm, but unfortunately my revenue per staff is 300. What does that mean? What does that mean?
That you have a higher level of staff than is typical for that revenue.
Exactly. Perfect statement. Very precisely worded, perfect statement.
I've already gotten burned a couple times.
Yeah. The trap is, well, we're overstaffed. No, I don't know if we are, but we have more people than a firm of this size. There are some very legitimate, valid reasons to having more people than a firm of this size. We're investing in growth. We have a different service model. We work with different clients. We just wanted to have more people because we wanted to. So there are many explanations for that, but the important part is we just have more people than a firm of this revenue size. On the other hand, if we see that we have 500,000 per staff member and the benchmark is 350, what does that mean? We have fewer people than a firm of this size. If that happens, I'll be scratching my head wondering, is it time to hire? Are we missing the boat somewhere? Is it time to do something about it? Although a lot of what happens on the revenue per staff will be correlated to your revenue per client. Sometimes there are firms that have very high revenue per client, and as a result of that, they have very high productivity numbers, very high revenue per staff. They're typically very profitable. Cook will be a great example of that. It's just your clients have such wonderful quality that you achieve very high productivity because an advisor in your firm works with 80 clients, but those 80 clients, each of them generates 30,000 in revenue. That's fantastic productivity numbers, and you're doing very, very well. Sometimes you can see the opposite. A firm works with very, very wealthy clients. The general account sizes are very large, but it also means you have to provide a lot of services. That typically happens to multifamily offices and family offices that surround the client with a lot of people, then your staff productivity numbers will probably go down quite a bit. Typically, if your profitability is not right, your revenue per staff will not be right either. But just for the sake of argument, if it turns out your profitability is not right, but your revenue per staff is looking good, what does that mean? So you're not as profitable as you should be, but your revenue per staff is just fine. What does that mean? Very clearly.
Direct expenses high?
It probably is, but don't necessarily. Just very mathematically, it means we pay a lot to the people we have. We have the same number of people as everybody else, but we don't achieve the same profitability because we must be paying people a lot. So notice the correlation and interaction between these numbers. They speak to each other. And generally don't treat them in isolation. If we are not right on the profitability, then let's look at the other measures and they probably will tell us what's going on, or at least they will suggest what's going on. A single measure never tells you. It's almost like a human being. You can't just measure the temperature and say, oh, you're fine, It's whatever it is, 98.8, so you must be fine. Well, that number might be fine, but something else might not be. Or, your pulse is 120, so you're probably sick, you must be dying. Well, let's look at what else is happening there. Where's the blood pressure? Have they been running on a treadmill for the last 30 minutes? Those kinds of things. And then one last number that I want to offer is the revenue per advisor. Now it's total revenue divided by the number of advisors we have in the firm. That simply tells us what's the productivity of the advisory department in the firm. So of the 4 major departments, we're going to single and isolate the advisory department. And if our revenue per advisor is high, but our revenue per staff is low, what does that mean? Revenue per advisor is high, revenue per staff is low. That probably means we have a lot of people in operations and administration. Do we have too many? I don't know. We probably need to look at positions and descriptions and things like that. But we, generally speaking, have more than other firms do. If the opposite is true, we have low advisor productivity numbers, but relatively high staff productivity numbers. Revenue per advisor is low, revenue per staff is high.
So for to be defined as an advisor here, are you somebody with their own book of business? Or is it the paraplanner also includes the advisory company?
The paraplanner's in there too. It's just basically anyone who's a member of the advisory department. Service advisor, support advisor, paraplanner, financial advisor, lead advisor, partner, all of those positions are right there. You can definitely calculate the revenue per lead advisor, which will be someone who has their own book of business, if you will. That's an interesting number to look at as well. And it's somewhere in those compensation surveys. Make sense? Cool.
Will the revenue per professional always be the same as the direct expense number? Like the direct expense people? Are those people?
Generally, yes. Anybody who's in, so direct expense is advisory department and investment department. Revenue per advisor is only the advisory department. So the investment department is missing from that number. What are we trying to do there? Just simply focus on the very sort of point of contact with the client, if you will. And usually if you see revenue per advisor low, revenue per staff high, that just means you don't have enough operations people. As a result of that, probably advisors are drawn into operational tasks that they shouldn't be doing. In other words, kind of notice the numbers can tell you about what's happening in the firm. And to a degree, they should be validating or supporting what you discover during the strengths and weaknesses and SWOT analysis. So here's what I want to do. Take the next 20 minutes or so, give or take, till about 10:15. Take a look at those numbers. Profit, direct expense, overhead, growth, revenue per client, revenue per staff, and see what they tell you about your firm, and cross-reference them with your SWOT analysis, and see if they're supporting what you wrote in the SWOT analysis, and see if you want to add something to the SWOT analysis. So let's take about 20 minutes to do the benchmarking. When you do benchmarking, you are expected to produce a section on data analysis. So that very first slide yesterday, I was showing the table of contents, entry number 7, just basically says data analysis. All we're looking for is your observations from the P&L and ratios. Just really one page that says, our profit is lower than it should be, our productivity per staff is lower than it should be, our productivity per advisor is lower than it should be, our direct expense is higher than it should be, otherwise we're doing great. And we need to take a deeper look into what's happening here, but very clearly, we have a lot of people, we don't have enough clients for all of that, so something's going on here. Make sense? So ideally that section is really nothing more than maybe 2, 3, 4 graphs that really tell the picture of what's happening there. And then you do want to cross-reference that section to your SWOT analysis. If indeed your case produces these results, profitability is not as good as it should be, that should be a weakness that you've written up. If your productivity is not as good as it should be, that should show up in the weaknesses as well. On the other hand, the opposite could be true. We have very strong growth, we have excellent clients, we have great profitability. Brag about it in the strengths, because that's definitely something you want to know about it.